So thank you everybody for turning up. It's always a good start. I'm Christian Larrinaga. We've got a very distinguished panel of people here who are going to talk a bit around the Internet of Things and hopefully dive into it as well, and try to understand a few things about what's happening in the Internet of Things. What is it, and what could it become, and what are the interesting things that we need to be aware of, particularly in the conjunction between actually the technology development and the policy development. These things never go in sync, and we will probably have exactly the same thing happening on the Internet of Things, if such a thing ever exists, as we've had with any other internet or any other data network. With that, I'd just like to introduce each of the panelists. This is Nick Allott of Inquiring Minds on my right. He's done a lot of work on Internet of Things technologically speaking, and has been an instrumental force at Oxford previously, and now in Southampton, Inquiring Minds, to do with webinars and some of the areas of actually trying to standardize applications and things over the Internet of Things. There is Benedict, Addis, who is a well-known security researcher, and he's going to be showing some of the more generic things about internet security, just some of the things that he sees in his day-to-day work, which I think will give us a lot of clues to some of the things we should be looking out for as we extend device networks as well. Professor Chris Marsden, he's at Sussex University. He's a well-known lawyer who's writing a paper with, in fact, Ian Brown in the future, I believe, on Internet of Things. We are still. Apparently we are. Okay. And so he'll be talking a little bit more about the sorts of structural legal issues and questions that he's looking into. Alison Powell, the LSC, is a well-known researcher who's been doing a lot of work in smart cities and in a variety of areas of applications of Internet of Things. And Thanassis Tiropanis at the University of Southampton, the Web Observatory, and his work is really involved in the data areas of Internet of Things, and the work of the Web Observatory's interest in exploring and understanding how that will work. So, and myself, I'm just an internaut who try to build things on the internet, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. With that, can I introduce Benedict, who's going to start us off? I need to give a microphone.
It's okay, I can really want the video. You need the microphone. I have to go back to touch time.
Hello everyone. My name is Benedict Addis, and I work for an organisation called Shadow Server. Now, has anyone heard of Shadow Server around the room? Any hands at all? I'm looking all the way around. No. Okay. He's the ringer. So maybe it's worth spending 30 seconds explaining what Shadow Server do. So if you've ever wondered when certs find victims on the internet, so you've got you've got a big breach. My old team at the National Cybercrime Unit would investigate and follow the thread to find out who the bad guy was. But there's a whole bunch of victim data that comes out anytime we've got a breach, anytime there's an investigation, and generally that's reported or should be reported to a cert. It turns out that I'd imagine that certs will talk to each other and everything's rosy, and it turns out that doesn't quite happen so easily. And so Shadow Server performs some of the plumbing and some of the original intelligence that's passed to certs to do the very boring and unsexy job of notifying victims that they've been victimized. And it's kind of a weird world where we have to tell victims of hacks or compromises that they've been done over, and that's the business we're in. So we currently work with 80 of the 100 national certs to tell and provide reports overnight, every day, of various breaches and hacks. So we do some of the plumbing, but we also do some of the scanning ourselves to find out who's been compromised. We run malware samples. We've got about 400 million unique bits of malware in our repository. We've got about 10 years worth. But we also scan the entire IP4 space every day. So we run a scan for a whole bunch of different hacks and protocols. So we're actually doing, not just talking about it. And then this information gets reported out, and we work with certain countries that you wouldn't necessarily expect us to work with. So we are totally politically neutral and unbiased who we work with. So I thought it'd be interesting to give you a quick flavour, specifically of the scanning that we do. So out of the 21 possible vulnerable protocols, we scanned for a whole bunch of things, and the relevance of the Internet of Things is we're starting to scan for specific device flaws. So there was a bunch of routers made by a company called Nessus. Mark, does that ring a bell? Remember the Nessus routers? I think they were made and distributed in China. So there's anything in China is multiplied by 10 or 100 times the scale that we see anywhere else. So we scanned for these routers, found tens of millions in China, and after we reported it to CERT-CN in China, that number started coming down pretty quickly. So as a result of just daily reporting, you've got a problem on your network, we hope to improve the overall security of the internet in an enabler fashion. That's the premise. So it's a pretty straightforward one. So the Internet of Things stuff that we're seeing. Well, I managed to log myself out. Here we are. Too much chat, not enough typing. So I thought it'd be just quite fun to give you a flavour of the sorts of things that we see on our daily scans. And this is SNMP. It's one of the protocols we scan for. It stands for Simple Network Management Protocol. I have to be careful with the tech beside me. It's the protocol by which you manage other devices remotely over the internet. And when devices like video cameras or baby monitors or power stations and so on and so forth are sent out by the manufacturers, they often are sent out with default settings. They're set to public. You can set public or private. Public says this device is welcoming all comers, and people often don't change that even if it's clear that it shouldn't be a public device. They also advertise themselves over the internet with something called a system name and a system description, and we can search for those. So when we scan the entire IP naught space, so 4 billion odd IP addresses, every day, one of the things we query that on each of those IP addresses is, do you have a public SNMP service? Right? So we're not hacking, we're not breaking in, we're not entering even default passwords, we're just saying, are you running an SNMP device? And unsurprisingly, there's a lot of Internet of Things that are advertising themselves as SNMP. So everyone with me so far, have I lost anyone? Nods. Yeah. Right. So this is the live demo bit. So if we search for something like video, and just to be clear, this is searching our database, which is live from yesterday. So we're sort of looking at a yesterday, up until yesterday's worth of stuff. This is, I'm sure, when we find that we have the cursor of the demo. Mm-hmm. I think I might have to have a. This should be coming back quicker than this, so I think I might have to have a word with the techs and postpone the live demo until later on into the presentation. So let me get working on that, and I'll pass back to Christian to show you what we find. But it's kind of interesting, so hopefully we'll get something up on screen in a second.
Everyone's furiously shutting off their mobiles.
Too late.
Okay, so we'll come back to that. So what the next thing I'd like us to explore is a bit about how the standards of Internet of Things is. And one of the things that's intrigued me about Internet of Things is that I'm not actually sure what the Internet of Things is. For me, there is an internet, which is a means of connectivity between devices. That's basically what we've been building, that's basically what we've been using, and that's basically why we write applications on the web or wherever to run over it. So what is this thing about Internet of Things? When I started in the business in the early 80s, we had a thing called process control and automation, and we did quite a bit of work in making fluids and things flow through small tubes and changing valves on and off and this sort of thing. And to that sense, we had a lot of intelligence and devices which were, today's standards, very stupid, which controlled that and actually, did some servos that actually do the actual changes from on and off. But obviously, devices today and the way people are thinking about Internet of Things is much more broad and much more intrusive. Those networks that we formed were basically very twisted pair wires. They were segregated. They weren't linked to any other network on the whole. They were just doing what they were doing. But people talk about Internet of Things, they seem to be talking about something far more pervasive, far more perhaps uniform in some sense. Something I don't see in practice at the moment. So I'd like to pass on to Nick Allott, who's done doing a lot of work actually implementing Internet of Things, networks and devices and standards.
What do you want the definition? You can make it up as you go along. We just tell us what you've seen. Okay, so starting point. I mean, some people get religious about the distinction between Internet of Things and Web of Things. I don't make any real distinctions on that front. To me, the simplest possible definition is, I mean, everyone in this room has got devices, but most of those devices are essentially acting as clients. They're consuming content and data that's on the internet. The fundamental thing that's different about the Internet of Things is this device becomes a server. It actually becomes content which is consumed on something else. So it's sort of like it's an inversion of the way people are currently using it. Now, when you take the definition in that sense, certainly where we started looking at it, it wasn't classic Internet of Things. It was things like TVs or cars or other relatively large sort of like fact devices, but they have content on there that you want to access from something else. And as such, it has a lot of the properties which people are now thinking more in terms of Internet of Things. The reality of these ridiculously inflated numbers that you see all the time is really underpinned by the fact is those sort of like basic protocols can be enabled on very, very, very small devices. So the amount of things that can act as a server, the amount of things that can generate content that you can consume elsewhere just become absolutely enormous. So as a starting definition, I'll start with that. It's a device which is acting as a server. So my second observation, certainly when it comes to standards, so I'm ex-CTO of a couple of standards organisations, and for people who aren't aware how standards organisations really work, they're basically businesses. Now what that means is when new technology comes along, every standards body in existence goes into an instant land grab and tries to protect a bit of it for itself because that establishes revenue for itself going forward. That's the motivation behind it. The consequences is it would be impossible for me to sit here and give you a landscape of what's happening in the Internet of Things. The only thing that I can tell you is almost any standards body you can think of, if it doesn't already have a strategy, it's developing a strategy around it. So there's a huge amount of FUD that's being generated. The other end of the spectrum from the stuff that we're doing now, which is in terms of real world deployments, I actually count the number of technologies that we're taking notice of, on one hand. So you look at it at a couple of layers. I mean, the first layer is, physically, what network is it running over? So the first anomaly about the Internet of Things, I would say, is in the real world, there usually is no I. There usually is no internet. For reasons of both physics and economics, i.e. the cost and battery length and the way the radio works, most real-world IoT devices are working off technologies that don't support an IP stack. So in the real world, a lot of the stuff that we're doing, building energy management, it's all running off 433.868 ISM band stuff, old-fashioned radio. Now, it is internet capable in that we put proxy somewhere such that it can be addressed from a client elsewhere. But at the actual point of the device, there is no IP stack. Going up the scale, the more longer range thing. So things like Weightless End, which did a launch in London yesterday, Sigfox, which is the French technology company, and actually a number of others. Interestingly, all of these IoT network technologies also do not support IP out of the box. And again, this just comes down to pure efficiency reasons. You can't argue with the laws of physics, and essentially, if you look at the details, what it means is you cannot leave a device on for a reasonable amount of time without draining the battery. And again, in the real world, that is what you need for an IoT device. The biggest cost of an IoT device is the cost of sending someone around to change the batteries. So nothing to do with the network. On that layer, the actual physical network layer, you want to be looking at a lot of the technologies that don't support IP out of the box. Higher up the stack, I mean, there's loads of people doing sort of like IoT payload data, but predominantly the most prolific ones would be CoAP, which is an IETF standard, MQTT, which is an IBM promoted one, and the stuff that we've been heavily involved in, we promote strongly JSON RPC. We have a slightly different hand on it. JSON RPC is basically a way that you JSON, you wrap up data blocks for use on the web. RPC means you can remote it, and you can essentially remotely call a function. And the JSON RP stuff, I'm an advocate of, and essentially because it's quite neat. There are already web standards such as geolocation for get location. That is often the first IoT device that you want to enable. You want to find the location of, my phone or my car. So wouldn't it be nice to use the same method that you use on the web, then by the magic of sort of like technology and internet proxies, it go into that actual device and retrieve that thing. And then the final point I won't talk about now, or maybe come back to this later, is to follow up on the security theme. In my opinion, I think the opinion of a lot of other people, the fundamental barrier to uptake of IoT is going to be the implementation of good enough security technologies. Not just because the data itself is sensitive, because if you understand about security, you'll understand that the security framework predicates what commercial ecosystem you can build on top of it. Is that enough for a start?
That's brilliant.
Thank you very much, Nick. That's taken us through a huge explosion. In fact, there's a lot of information in that in one go, crossing all the layers from the infrastructure right up to the web. So I think that we'll have a lot to ask questions on later. But before I do, I'd like to ask Alison to perhaps extend what Nick's talked about in terms of the work that she's been doing at Addis.
Yes, thank you, and thank you to Christian for the opportunity to come and participate in this really excellent workshop. So I am going to focus a little bit on what the individual consumer or citizen experience might be of the Internet of Things. And I think the Internet of Things, like William Gibson said about the future, is already here but unevenly distributed. So we actually do have lots of Internet of Things technology that's already around us, but we might not understand exactly what that is. And certainly now, as Nick has explained, not all of that is actually working on the Internet, which has some consequences for how we experience it, and also what might end up happening to the data that we produce or try and share across these various different systems. So I think what we are faced with, unfortunately, is largely an internet. At the moment, we have an internet of commercial things, and I think in the future, what we may well have is an internet of broken things. And so I want to just sort of talk about these two things: the internet of commercial things and the internet of broken things. And the internet of commercial things is the one that we currently experience. So, how many people in this room use a fitness tracker or a fitness band? Not very many fitness tracker, fitness band.
Or I'm married to somebody.
Oh, right. Okay.
Everyone in the world.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I talk to my students and I talk through these kinds of issues, they all raise their hands and say, yes, I have a fitness band. Because these are the kinds of devices that people use in their everyday life. And they use them because they perceive them as being valuable. They help people to understand what they're doing in their daily lives. But they also produce lots and lots and lots of data in the completely siloed model that we saw earlier, that Brian presented, which is where the sensor that you're wearing on your wrist is connected somehow to the internet, but all the analytics, all the data storage, all the kind of management of that data is happening in a cloud server that is only going to really be accessed by the fitness tracker provider, or possibly by the company that the fitness tracker provider sells its customer data to. So then we have a kind of experience of a really useful device that is entirely in a privatized and commercial ecosystem. And this is the everyday reality of what people experience as the Internet of Things. And this means that there is proprietary control both of the devices and also of the data that's produced by the devices. And it means that it's very difficult to get interoperability between different kinds of devices, because my fitness tracker might be provided by Jawbone or Fitbit, and it may not necessarily work with the other kinds of devices that that I want to use. Maybe I also want to use a smart thermostat on my house. Maybe I also have a car. So these don't necessarily interoperate. And that maybe is not a bad thing, because if they did, then you have this sort of panoptic eventuality, which is one sort of outcome of the Internet of Broken Things. The other outcome of the Internet of Broken Things is what Cory Doctorow calls the inkjet printer model. And he says the Internet of Things, as the main business model for the Internet of Things, is that it comes broken out of the box and it's locked, so that when you have to buy the parts, you buy the parts from the person who sold you the broken inkjet printer. And to go back to our sort of everyday life experience, people mostly experience frustration when dealing with these kinds of business models, and they're very efficient for the companies that are able to manage that entire cloud infrastructure that Brian presented, where they get all of the value out of all of the data, and they get all of the analytics, and they get all of the future value of selling off all the customer data, but people don't get much control. And there's some examples of this. I'm actually a researcher in media and communication, so I do try and figure out what people are actually saying out in the world about these things. And so I'll give you two great examples. One of them is one of my favorite IoT blogs is the Fuck Yeah Internet Fridge Tumblr. If you have not seen Fuck Yeah Internet Fridge, you should definitely consult it, because it tracks over long historical time the persistent fantasy of the useful internet fridge. So has anybody ever thought about buying an internet fridge? Nobody in this, and we are probably like the UK's most Internet of Things savvy people, right? And so if the Internet of Things savvy people do not want to buy internet fridges, nobody wants to buy them. So there are lots of promises for these interconnected devices, but the models that we have are the models that are either the kind of commercial Internet of Things or this sort of Internet of Broken Things. And my second popular culture example is the Twitter account Bad IoT Day. And Bad IoT Day also kind of documents the sort of hilarious consequences of really limited interoperability. Some more serious examples include, and you can look this one up, the fight between the John Deere tractor company and the U.S. Copyright Office, because I've come from grain growing part of North America, and I mean, fixing your own tractor is pretty well essential to producing your livelihood. And so when the John Deere tractor company said that farmers could no longer actually modify the machinery that allows them to harvest their fields, and they could only do firmware upgrades if they were approved by John Deere, some of the consequences of the Internet of Broken Things became a little bit more obvious. So I think I'm going to stop there. I have some other things that I might sort of propose as possible solutions and ways forward, but I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say before then.
Are you ready to go?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Back to you.
It's like
Ogilvy Van der Waal.
Yes. Oh yeah, that's another great example. There's also a copy machine, and they've made an animation of the connected copy machine from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which my students also thought was hilarious.
Nice, you got Cambridge, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
just a quick, Olivier, how much of this off mic are you getting? He's in Nice. I'm in the meeting downstairs.
But don't worry, he's saving children. No.
So we've all got sweary tumblers to look at. I think that's the most no. So a million years ago, I started running a search in our database of IP scanning, looking for devices that were hanging out on the internet with a system description of video. And as you can see in the top left, not just about see, we've got 61,500 unique IPs that we found hanging out, advertising themselves publicly as video devices. And so we've got, if I scroll here, you can see, we'll just have a gentle scroll down and we might see some interesting things. The one that's worth watching is this column here where my mouse is, which is the system name. So that's the name given by the users to it. So we'll just start to see all sorts of interesting things. When I last run this, we saw boardroom video conferencing. We saw the ORR, which we worked out was the Office of the Rail Regulator, boardrooms with video conferencing devices there. So whose liability? Are we going to? I think Chris, you're going to be talking about liability.
I suspect we have some of the reason why there's speculation.
I'll just say that Cisco bought Tangent. It must be their corporate gift that's being damaged in terms of the fact that Tangberger, legacy system, just a name, now owned by Cisco. Does that become Cisco's problem? Do they just say, well, Tangberger sold it, nothing to do with us, we'll just put the whole idea of these 6 stack generic systems and figure it out away.
But at least they're a tech. So you mentioned, and again, I'm not sure if it's been picked up on the audio, but you mentioned that we're seeing Tandberg here a lot, which was a company acquired by Cisco. Who holds that liability? It's a really important question. At least they're a tech company. At least they have some use of. Here we are. At least they have some familiarity with electronics. The point was made. I think we talked about Fitbit or Nike. How do they have any experience at all of dealing with large amounts of data? I've drawn myself a little diagram here. One of the things that interests me is not the device itself, but where in my career looking at cybercrime, we often notice that the criminals obviously went straight for the aggregation of data, so not the devices, but the server where those devices are held. And that's also, I think, as Nick has touched upon, is often going to be internet connected. At the moment we've got a protocol break, so a different protocol stack operating on the devices themselves. That's not necessarily true when the data is aggregated. So just having bought a little time, I've just done a search for a system named Army, as again a little test for you. And so we see again in this column, okay, I'm guessing is the Oklahoma National Guard, some sort of repeater. We're seeing all sorts of interesting things there. It looks like Samsung are providing some sort of device here to some sort of Army APT 101 Dong in Korea. I don't know what that means.
Well, they've got to do something on that video.
So there's some interesting results. Anybody like me to try a search for anything?
Can I ask you a serious question? Really serious one. So here's the question.
You pass the microphone.
Dave myself. So we've got OpenNMS, which is a product that we recommend UK researchers amongst others. SNMP is one of its bread and butter. There was a big outcry against the network time protocol, to the extent that every ISP on the planet, pretty much because of poor implementation in the Unix implementations of Linux, started to block port 123, which is NTP. Up until that date, my poorly protected video server had reasonably legally admissible evidential value because it was NTP'd. Now, you do one of these shows, the message some people take away is, SNMP, let's block that port. Okay, we'll block it across the internet. And that's what's happened with NTP. I have seen no one get up on stage and say from any ISP, well, we blocked NTP, they just did it, to protect you all. But you lose all credibility on your home networks once you lose the timestamps. Now, this is the danger of you doing a demo like this.
Thank you. The point is to say we should be patching, obviously, and not blocking ports. So if that's not clear, it's about patching. It's about being aware of what devices you're installing and aware what default settings the manufacturers are providing. But in answer to answer your question more fully, patching is the one thing that's not going to happen on IoT devices. we heard about batteries not being replaced. If that's going to be almost impossible, deploying patches again across a protocol break might be even more of a challenge. So with that, I'm going to come over to the other side of the table. Thank you for paying attention to the demo.
Well, all that flood of data leads us on to what we do with all this data. If we have a lot of companies out there who are not used to dealing with data in this way, and certainly not used to dealing with their customers and their suppliers' data in this sort of sphere, what happens, and both now and into the future. So I'll hand this over to Thanassis now, who is interested in data.
Thank you, Christian. And before I get to the data part, I'll say just a couple of things about interdisciplinary areas, very, very briefly, because you're going to hear me say web science and then internet science, and you say, what is he talking about? And how does that relate to things? So web science and internet science are two interdisciplinary areas. We believe that the web takes more than one discipline to understand its impact and how it affects people's lives. And similarly, it's the same case for the internet. And we work with social scientists, with lawyers, with economists. It's a group of people who work in this area, try to understand the extent of the impact of the web and the internet, respectively. So they are top-down areas. They have agendas, and the agendas are to look after the web and the internet, respectively. So there is the Web Science Trust, and Southampton has a key role in that, but also Oxford, for example, where Web Science Trust network laboratories. And Internet Science, there is a big network of excellence, and Chris, Alison, and Ian and I are part of that consortium, and Christian keynoted at our last conference. So in these two areas, we're trying to, we're dealing with data. In order to take care of the web or of the internet, respectively, you have to understand what is happening there. So when we started to deal with web observatories, we had a problem. The problem is that we have about 15 labs around the world. They all have data sets that we would like to share, and there was no efficient way of sharing those data sets. Either we put them all together in one central location and we provided people with access to it, or we let people access data sets where they stood. And similarly for analytic tools, we wanted people to be able to use a tool that does some network analysis from one lab on a data set on another lab. So a web observatory, the concept is that it's an infrastructure that includes people, it includes data sets, and includes analytics. And we basically have a web observatory at each lab, and we try to make them connect with each other. So I'm in Southampton, I can access my data sets, I can access my analytic tools and those of my colleagues. And then when I want to use the MIT infrastructure, I'd like to be able to discover what's there and to use their data sets and analytic tools. So while doing that, although it was a web observatory for the web, to understand the web, we saw that the aspect with the web became particularly important because it's a mechanism that we were interested to explore whether it can scale. Whether with a web of observatories like that, we could discover datasets and use them where they are without having to download them, just query them where they are around the world. And we are talking about this web observatory as a concept that addresses the middle layer between the big data layer, where businesses can invest in data warehouses and data analysts, big data analytics, and the lower layer, where you just have data sets from the web that you have to download and install on your own machine and do your analytics. And we have a paper with Christian and Jim Hendler and Wendy Hall on that, a kind of manifesto paper on how that works. So we're looking at how we can connect data sets and analytics around the world, make them discoverable, and also not rely on just public data sets, open data sets. If people want to make data sets open and available, fine. If they don't want to, we don't judge them. Let them do as they want. So on the web of observatories, if somebody puts a data set forward, it's up to them to decide whether they want to make it public or whether they want to make it private and control access to it. And standards for giving control to public, but also for private data sets is an essential part of this activity that is going on. So we are deploying this network. We have networks, laboratories that have web observatories. We deployed a big one in Australia for Australian government for government data sets, and also with Infosys in India. And we're facing many problems. And I'm going to quote the 5 Ps of data. And I'm going to quote a colleague who's a lawyer and web scientist and internet scientist, Caroline Wilson, who says data are precious. They are valuable when they are pulled together. They are not property. They have a purpose, and they also raise concerns to privacy. So we're trying to see how we can deploy these infrastructures, taking all those P's into account. And as if we didn't have enough trouble doing that, now we have to deal with things. So the reason we have to deal with so many data on the web is because people started to produce data. Yes, in the beginning, it's a typical narrative that in the beginning we're just reading web pages, and then we started to produce content and blogs and data. And we're having things now that are being deployed around the world that are producing even more data. And the problem is, how do those data become available and shared in a controlled manner where people are in control around the world? And I can see that there is a kind of continuum there. On one end of the spectrum, you can say that things are owned by individuals. Their data are reported to personal data stores that belong to those individuals. And those individuals, maybe through web observatories, through the access control mechanism, they can decide who to share their data sets when. At the other end of the spectrum, I can say that, I'm a big company, I deploy things, I give them to you for free, they report back to me, and I give you back some goods. I can tell you, what the energy consumption is in your house. Yes, that's another model. Or we have freemium models in the middle. And we can end up with too many things if I have a company putting things in my garden and me putting my own things. And I'm not sure whether we're going to be talking about things pollution in the future, but it is a possible scenario. So the way that we make these decisions and the models that emerge, maybe the freemium model in the middle, where we have some people pay for to keep ownership of their things. We can own things, but we cannot own their data. Lawyers tell me. So the ways in which I always listen to lawyers, yes, including Chris. So the way we do that and the decisions that we make today will influence how far innovation can go in the future, we feel. And it's very good to be here and start this discussion with all of you today. Thank you.
Okay, so the Web Observatory, or lots of web observatories, is a way of dealing with data. Chris, now your turn to sort of put the
cliche dystopian moment where the lawyer steps up and says that the world's about to fall down. I can't think of a better version, actually, than this Register headline from 2 months ago, reporting on a Veracode study on the Internet of Things. The Internet of Stuff is a gigantic ultra-perv robbery network study. I'm not going to be quite that cliched. Yeah, entire Internet of Things project is a terrifying vision of DigiCrim's paradise. Okay, so let's get that out of the way and say that I'm not going to talk about that specifically. I'm actually interested in socio-legal research, so the effect of regulation on the way that we use the internet specifically. And that doesn't mean what laws are passed, because many silly laws are passed and many of those silly laws have no effect. You remember the late 90s wave of electronic signature laws, how useful those all were. A friend of mine was in Cuba on holiday, and because he was an internet lawyer, internet law professor, he was actually called in to write the Cuban electronic signature law. So Cuba had an electronic signature law in 1999. Of course, they didn't actually allow citizens to use the internet for several years after. But anyway, so I'm interested in the actual implementation of these laws. And I should apologise that you're going to listen to me talking about the Internet of Things and privacy, and then later you'll hear Ian talk about net neutrality. And it reminds me of the story about a room or building very much like this,
where in the attic they discovered an old painting in an old violin, and one was a Stradivarius, and the other one was by Van Gogh. Except the problem was Van Gogh was terrible at designing violins. However, Ian is wonderful at describing net neutrality. I'm not quite so good at the Internet of Things, so I'll try to be very brief. I think the reason why I like that expression, Internet of Stuff, is because it's only when it really affects consumers and the public in a relatively ubiquitous way that we begin to get very worried as lawmakers and as people interested in the influence on society about how these things are going to affect us. So the fact that the Internet of Things has been around for arguably at least 25 years is not so much the issue. It's the issue of how it's affecting things now. And actually, I was reminded by Alison's example of the orange smart house of, what was it, 1998, I think everyone remembers, the fridge that they had and the way that it spoke to the family. So Internet of Stuff is used a lot as an expression, really to explain the ubiquity of the Internet of Things, and particularly it's been used a lot recently by another one of my co-authors. So Ian's one of my co-authors, as is Alison, as is Thanassis, as is Jonathan Cave. Jonathan's a behavioural economist who's written a lot about regulation of the Internet of Things for the European Commission in particular. He was a senior consultant at RAND Europe. He's now on the, I think it's still called the Regulatory Policy Committee of the UK government, even post-election, unless they call it something different now. But in any case, it's in charge of deciding whether regulation is silly or sensible, and if it's sensible, it's allowed to go into law, and if it's silly, it's not. In other words, if it doesn't do what it's designed to do. There is a lot of, I don't sell any of you guys, I guess, because if you're interested in internet governance, you will be very aware of your own versions of silly regulations, which have never been allowed to be put into law. But Jonathan wrote a lot about the conundrum which we've actually had really since the beginning of the internet, which is that if consumers are supposed to be adopting these technologies and they don't trust them, then you end up with a smaller market than you would do otherwise. And obviously that's the cost of doing business. So there's always this difficult cost-benefit analysis between early adopters who at least know what the risks are and decide whether or not to adopt a technology, and of course late adopters who, if they decide to be scared, may not decide to use the technology at all. My favorite example is the fact that people were told around the kind of internet boom 96, 97 that they shouldn't use their credit cards on the internet. And Citibank, who are the biggest issuer of credit cards in the world at that point, were desperate for people to stop using their credit cards in physical locations. They said it doesn't matter how much fraud there is on the internet, it's minuscule compared to what's going on in physical locations, where people are giving away their credit cards in restaurants and wondering where they are 20 minutes later. So with regard to that, I should say that I think that one of the issues that we need to deal with is that regulation is going to be a very, very small part of any solution that will make companies behave better. I'm not talking about the criminals because the criminals need to be caught, but in terms of regulation, for instance, to formalize standards, I think Nick probably has some war stories about how the formalization of standards is not normally around the best standard, about the most powerful standard. But I think that regulation that does attempt to formalize standards to at least inculcate some amount of consumer trust is bound to be a useful part of the future of the Internet of Things in the way that it's adopted properly. And I think that government has a role there, but government's larger role is, I think, around education, which I think was it David's question earlier on in the previous keynote about if we can educate people about how to use this, it will help them tremendously. I should say that another concept I want to introduce, apart from the Internet of Stuff, is one that William Heath, who sadly can't be with us anymore, said to me, you must tell people that you should talk about the Internet of polite things. The Internet of Things that allow users to keep control, the Internet of Things that asks people before it does things with their data. I wanted to ask, I was fascinated that almost no one in here uses a Fitbit. You're all fairly fit-looking people. So I assume that because you're technically savvy, you're actually privacy paranoid, is that right? Good, okay, so I don't need to preach to the room about why you wouldn't. If I gave you a free Fitbit, would anyone wear one? Right, okay. Robin might do.
There is such a huge business model for people who are not in this room.
Right, so people who actually don't know the risks and are naturally risk-taking.
Or, you know, the value that they're getting back from having some access to their data is somehow in their minds.
I'm going to pass this to Alison and then Ian and then I may say something else.
Sorry, I just wanted to kind of come back on that. I mean, yes, we might be in a room full of, people who don't want to wear Apple Watches and don't want to wear Fitbits and don't want to play in the Internet of Things consumer playground, but that is not what is happening outside this room. So people are quite happy to make a bargain in which there is some personal data that's collected about them that they have no idea what the eventual use will be, and it is sufficient to have some personal data come back that people will make that bargain. And I think the other interesting thing, which I didn't say earlier, but I wanted to kind of bring in because I promised to talk about smart cities and then failed. But cities think about this as a reasonable bargain to make on behalf of their citizens as well. And they think, well, a reasonable bargain for us to make is to, collect more transport data, ambient data, temperature, environmental data, movement data on streets, and then send that to an analytics company who will do some analytics and sell back a result to us. And that is also a completely reasonable bargain that that governments make. So these happen already.
Two quick points. No one may have a Fitbit, but how many people have new iPhones which do have motion sensors in and which are by default are switched on? I found to my surprise 6 months of daily walking data recently, which I deleted, but I've never asked them to switch it on. But following up on also what Alison was saying, there was a really interesting Pew's survey, I think it was just a week or two ago, which I'll find and tweet, which found that this idea, which is a very prevalent meme in discussions of privacy, especially in the US, that many people, not all clearly, are happy to exchange personal data in exchange for services. This study found actually that was much less true than was thought. People were resigned and felt hopeless that this would happen, whatever they thought. It wasn't that they'd made a conscious, happy trade.
Chris, I just wanted to say I haven't been given a Fitbit, but I have been given what I think, in retrospect, is one of the cruelest prizes that privacy specialists can win, which is a Chromebook. I'm genuinely wondering what the hell to do with it. And the only thing I can think of is, if anyone in the room has a privacy-related or a persona or pseudonymity-related experiment they would like me to do on the basis of a Chromebook, please come and find me afterwards.
That's a great idea. Is it going to be like the ZX81?
Not nearly as much fun. It hasn't even got that wonderful version of basics that ZX81 used to have.
Of course, you should use your Chromebook to do all your writing offline and then transfer it to a different device before you actually transfer it online, I guess. It's
can't even use it until
oh, then throw it away. Easy come, easy go. I want to make just one final point, which is that, and it's about the notion of regulation. And I suppose we set up the panel in a traditional way of technologists to people talking about markets to incomes, the nasty lawyer talks about regulation. But I just want to say that I think it's Nick, I hope would agree with this, that regulation is what the powerful do to the less powerful, and in standards organizations, those who write the standards are those who are more powerful, and that's inevitably the way that these things will work out. It's often been said that the most interesting aspect of standards organizations is that they're, in the end, the recommendation of standards is less to do with technology and more to do with politics. I think the actual quote is nothing to do with technology and everything to do with politics, by which I mean corporate politics as opposed to democratic politics. So Magna Carta, a lovely example of exactly the same thing. A digital Magna Carta, of course, would, as we know, come out of Theresa May's copybook rather than anyone else's. So on that, it's worth noting that there are, of course, different ways in which regulation can happen to you as an innovator or as a consumer. One is that you have a dominant company standard, and we just had this nice Chromebook example as an example, or the Apple Watch for that matter. Another example would be, of course, a dominant standard which is set in a private standards making organization, which may or may not be more effective or more less democratic, should we say, than a more open standards organization. And I realize that these things are a question of degree rather than a question of purity. There's very little purity, I think, in standards making. But I think there does have to be a role, and it's a very, very small role, for let's say the Buddha-like enlightened regulator, in just making sure, at the very least, that people do actually think about privacy when they're deploying these kinds of nodes. And so it is essential that the regulator has these powers to enforce and does actually enforce them at least once, just to show that they exist. So if there's anyone from the Information Commission or Ofcom or someone who'd like to tweet to them, it would be worth actually showing that these powers do exist. And one of the interesting elements, I think, of the pushback on the European data protection regulation was the concept that somehow enormous fines would be handed out all the time. I think it's a fantasy. Anyone who's dealt with competition law very much knows that the instance of enormous fines is very unusual. And funnily enough, the companies that receive those enormous fines are weeping with gratitude at the fact that the case has taken that long to come to court, that they've actually had that fine several years after their dominance has continued. You know, nothing like being fined $1 billion when you manage to keep going for 5 years with a practice which is then found to be illegal. So I think it is essential that regulators at least acknowledge the fact that there may be privacy invasions that happen. I think that one of the problems we had with previous data protection law is a combination, frankly, of supine information commissioner in this country, and I should say it's by no means the worst, of course. Anyone care to guess how many people work in the data protection regulator in Luxembourg? Home of Amazon and Sky? Yeah, half of them. Well, actually, that's actually true, because there's at last count there were 13, and of course that includes people who open the mail and answer the phone and you know, arrange the conference table. So yeah, about half. And also, I think all of us are familiar with Port Arlington, the glorious town in the middle of Ireland, where we find the regulation taking place at Facebook and Google and others. So one of the problems we've had up to now is that this nonsense claim that the Data Protection Directive is somehow extremely harsh law is not enforced. You can write anything you want to. There used to be on the statute books 58, I was going to say 58,000, it's only a slight exaggeration, private members' bills that were passed allowing all kinds of access for railway companies across private land. None of these became enforced and they were removed from the books. We have to be conscious of the fact that if we have a law that has some teeth and is actually enforced, then we can have a reasonable argument about its cost benefit. But where we have a 20-year-old law that just isn't enforced, and if it is enforced, maximum fine until 3 years ago was what, 50 grand? For no matter what size of data breach you had? Let's be serious. That's not real regulation. So 99.99999% of regulation is going to be about standards, the way they're adopted and the way they're implemented. That minuscule amount is the ability of the regulator to demonstrate that there is at least one tiny piece of, albeit technically incompetent, democratic control over the overall process, given that, after all, we do expect billions of people to be affected by the internet of polite stuff.
That's great. I'd like to start to open it up to I hope so. That gets us all going. There's only one question I'll throw out just on top of what you were saying, which is this whole thing of jurisdiction and international global issues, both at the internet layer and the governance layers, and also the applications themselves and the localization of regulation. I think you were addressing mainly in the application side, the data side, this issue broached on this morning actually very well, which is this idea of moving gambling shops to even less salubrious offshore islands. Is a phenomenon often done by lawyers, regulators, pinching laws in such a way that actually puts people, incentivizes them to move to a worse place from a regulatory perspective. Any questions? Yes, please. Okay, no,
it's very obvious. One of the interesting things about the e-commerce directive when it was first passed, it's very interesting. If you don't regulate in the place where the consumer does business, that will inevitably happen. And if we think that's a problem for the internet, we should look at tax laws. And Chatham House has had many conferences about the way in which global institutions react to tax regulation changes. The answer always is, if you regulate at the place where the consumer does business, you can effectively regulate. Lawyers will find private companies employ lawyers to find 58,000 reasons why you can't implement regulation. Of course they do. That's their job. They're very well paid to do it.
There you go, from a lawyer.
I'm very poorly paid lawyers, so probably that.
Was about the CEO for American Research. Marco, right, NCC. Tying up to what Chris said, and also in terms of what Benedict showed us earlier, there's a lot of focus on standardization, but how far is this actually a problem that sits within the human users of those standards, and how the panel think where do we start in basically educating people? Because the example you just gave is frankly it's not a problem of the technology itself. It's people using the technology, people pushing data in, and the same is with Benedict, people using default settings that are insecure. So what I mean, basically, open question to the panel: where do we start? Do we start fixing the protocols, or do we start fixing the people?
Yeah.
David Sell, Treasurer for the open source group, the BCS. I'll tweet it again, but I encourage you all to look at ossg.bcs.org. We've done several things where we get kids, youngsters, building and doing stuff. My chair last Saturday helped train over 1,000 young ladies in building their first app. But prior to that, we had children as young as 4 for an Easter egg hunt, building Internet of Things devices on mini Arduinos to light lights. So I'm just saying that really it's not what we think, it's not even the way we think that's going to matter, it's the way the youngsters today, who are the engineers of tomorrow, will deploy. And the DevOps culture says we should deploy environments that are inherently safe to write those apps on. Now, it seems to me that the Internet of Stupid Things, and I'll put the link in, is what we are suffering. We've got embedded protocol errors. We've got obviously devices that can't cope. And the fact that people are now on rapid deployment cycles to save money gives us the potential to write millions of stupid things that can't be recalled. So this is the fear, and it's the youngsters.
Thanks a lot. Really interesting presentations, and also as someone who's trying to find out more about this area, really great to have references that you've given out about where to find more. So thank you for that. One of the things I did come across was advice from the FTC in the United States, which seemed actually very good and sensible about, building with privacy by design and thinking about security. And at sort of almost the same point that came out, I read in the Register, Chris, about, lunar internet beds. And when you think, I can't really think of anything more private and personal than what you do in bed, right? And an interview with the CEO who was completely unaware of FTC guidance or the need really for thinking about security or privacy. And I think that, as usual, we're sort of catching up with things that are already on the market, and hopefully they will all be broken soon, so we don't need to worry too much. But it does seem like we're kind of going in. The problems we'll look back on the problems that we have now with the internet and think, oh, isn't that sweet? How lovely and sweet it was compared to what we have now with the Internet of Things, which is a nightmare. I just wanted to know whether you rate the FTC guidance and whether you think it will do anything useful.
Yeah, the FTC gives great guidance because apart from anything else, they have wonderful people like Ed Felton who they bring on board to work with them. Two interesting things. First of all, the FTC, for those who don't know, the Federal Trade Commission is the privacy regulator in the United States, and they actually hand out much larger fines than our friends in Port Arlington, amongst other things. I pick on Port Arlington just because it's just such a wonderful example of small town regulating very, very large companies. A couple of things about defaults. I always assume that the people who use the internet are at least as technically unskilled as me, and I'm an idiot. So, and I think that's a useful default to have. And we must always assume that the default settings for the internet are privacy friendly. Now, that's not in anyone's business plan, sadly, today. And Alison talked a little bit about the fact that there are some scary business plans around, particularly about data broking, of course. I don't worry about the companies collecting that data. I worry about people collating it and brokering it. So I think it's absolutely essential that we set defaults for privacy on. It's a very trivial part of privacy by design, isn't it? But it's actually absolutely essential. And the only way that companies are going to choose to do that is if they're told that their business plans need to be privacy compliant. Now, I think venture capitalists don't particularly like the idea that there's regulatory risk involved in a startup deciding to collect data and then sell it on, but they do need to get used to the idea. And yes, I realise I may, I almost should paint Brussels on my forehead that somehow I'm chilling innovation and stopping the particular Internet of Things companies from actually coming into place. But we should never assume, and it sounds like they were doing fantastic work, but we can't educate the population to be so privacy aware and technically aware that they're going to make the right decisions all the time. I don't mean that we should nanny them. I just mean that we should assume that people are as idiotic as me, and that's the basis of good public policy. Assuming people are bright is the basis for really bad public policy.
Yeah, I've just got two more down here. So just quickly, I can't comment on the FTC thing, but on the other issues that brought up. In terms of what can we do, what's needed, I would argue on the standards and technology side, actually, we don't have to do anything. There is stuff out there at the moment. It might not be perfect, but it's certainly good enough to roll out IoT, as evidenced by the fact it is being rolled out. But I mean, there's certainly something there in place already. In terms of can you change user behaviour, I'd say good luck with that. It's almost impossible. On the regulation side, I mean, it might be naive, but I mean, as a user, there are essentially two things that I want, and I don't think the market's going to deliver it, and I think it will only happen through legislation. One is essentially audit. If it's my data, I want to know who's got it, what it's being used for. And two, revocation. I want the ability to retract any permission that I've given someone else to use it. I think if you could cleverly encapsulate those two very simple things at a high level, everything else would fix itself.
To clarify, I was mentioning the human factor, not necessarily the risk for educating the business decision is also part of that cycle. Can be part of it.
On the point that was made, whether we fix things first or people first, I feel certainly it has to be people first. If people are aware, then things will get fixed and regulation will get fixed in a much better way. But how we do that, I think that empowerment is an important thing. We have to empower people to share their data when and how they want. And therefore, we may have a data market for a change, because at the moment, there's no market for data. We don't know how much data are worth. We have a system where I give you storage, and you put your data in, and I make value and give you something back, which is more resembles feudalism, which has some disadvantages. I don't intend to make a provocative statement, but it's one model of doing things. But if we have people share, like with money, yes, money, you open up the market, you have a market that way. People can circulate money. They're aware how much this note is worth. Information flows in a similar way. We have to empowerment takes very small changes like that, like people being in control.
Very well said. I'm just thinking of the last time we saw each other, and I was talking about data feudal lords and data pirates. Yes, I think we're already quite clearly heading towards a situation in which data feudalism is a real possibility. And I'm going to suggest a couple of very pragmatic things. And I don't think you can fix only one thing. I think we have the capacity to build the technical system that works in a way that respects people, that allows people to understand how to manage their own data or how to exchange it if they want to have a market. But we don't have any organizational models to support that, because the organizational models have gone in for the low-hanging fruit, and they've set up frameworks that make it easier to go towards feudalism than towards a market. So I think there are some technical things that we could do, and there are some organizational things. So some of the technical things we can do to insist, perhaps through regulation, on open systems, so that there can be competition also on security, not only on privacy. And this goes back to the inkjet printer model. So if you actually know how the device works, then there can be a market in sort of third-party modifications. And I also think there needs to be a real regulatory effort towards removing barriers to creating privacy by design as a functional business model. And maybe I should also have Euro on my head, even though that's not maybe what my accent says. But I think the European Union can do this because I think we don't have a Silicon Valley culture yet. So within the UK and across Europe, I think we might be able to create a different kind of competitive ecosystem that really values privacy and puts that at in the center of the development of an industry. And that could also be the development of a different kind of IoT industry. Okay.
Any more questions before we wrap up? Because we need, I think, to hear them baying at the door, cups of tea and coffee. Well, with that, just to say thank you very much, panelists, for a very interesting afternoon. Thank you.